All right, Clause 2 through 6 are approved. Now, in Clause 7, we have an NDP motion, and I wonder if one of the NDP members would like to elaborate on it.
One of the NDP members would be delighted, Mr. Chair. So briefly, colleagues, this amendment would propose to add another provision to the purposes section of the bill, a new letter H, which would read that the purpose of this act is to protect public health and public safety, and in particular to, and here are the new words, recognize that criminal prohibitions on certain activities in relation to cannabis may have a negative impact on social determinants of health. For decades, evidence has been mounting that the so-called war on drugs has been a clear failure from a variety of perspectives, but particularly from a public health perspective. New Democrats have long understood that cannabis use isn't a moral failing or an issue of character, and that its criminal prohibition has, in most contexts, some would argue in all contexts, been more harmful than the substance itself. I think most tellingly, colleagues, we heard a lot of evidence in this committee about discretion being applied by police officers in enforcing this act and in applying penalties. And I think adding this purpose will serve as a guidepost to those officers in exercising their discretion. We heard of evidence from officers that said, and from I think the department officials, that there's discretion in terms of giving tickets or sometimes arresting. There's sometimes proceeding by summary conviction, sometimes by indictment. And I think that having a clear statement of purpose in this bill that recognizes that criminal prohibitions in respect to cannabis can have a negative impact on social determinants of health will help those officers and the people charged with administering this bill and exercising that discretion. I want to just give a couple of quotes to the committee. Dr. Eileen Davila, the medical officer of health with the Toronto Public Health, said that criminalization of cannabis use and possession impacts social determinants of health, such as access to employment and housing. Given that cannabis possession will soon be made lawful in Canada, I urge you to immediately decriminalize the possession of non-medical cannabis for personal use. That, of course, the latter sentence speaks to a different issue, of course, but her main sentence, I think, is clear. Michael DeViller, the assistant professor at McMaster University, said that issuing of more criminal records will continue to have a devastating impact on the social determinants of health of mostly young Canadians. Prohibition also poses a problem for those who are dependent on cannabis and are seeking treatment to improve their lives. In my experience as a counselor, I have never encountered a patient who was helped by a criminal record. It actually impeded their efforts. Kirk Tusaw said, public health isn't just about the health consequences or benefits of using a particular substance. Public health also includes considerations of undue and unnecessary criminalization of people, use of the courts, use of the legal regime, misuse of police resources, distrust between the police, and all of those other things are amplified by taking some sort of restrictive approach to people accessing relatively safe products like cannabis. And finally, I just want to quote our two ministers that came. The Minister of Health, Honourable Petipa Taylor, said, protecting the health and safety of Canadians is a priority of our government and the focus of this bill. Canadians use cannabis at some of the highest rates in the world, and decades of criminal prohibition have not reduced these rates. In fact, cannabis has become the most commonly used illegal substance in Canada. Our youth have the highest prevalence of cannabis use when compared with peers in other developed countries. This clearly shows that the current approach to cannabis is not working. To echo what my colleagues have indicated, the evidence is clear that prohibition, the status quo, is just not working. And finally, Mr. Chair, Honourable Jody Wilson-Raybould, the Minister of Justice, said this: there is a broad consensus among Canadians that our current approach to cannabis is not working. Our system of criminal prohibition fosters an environment where organized crime reaps billions of dollars in profits from its sale, where thousands of Canadians each year end up with criminal records for non-violent cannabis offences, where cannabis is not being kept out of the hands of young people. So, in conclusion, Mr. Chair, I think that adding a clear purpose that states that one of the purposes of this act is to recognize that criminal prohibitions on certain activities in relation to cannabis may have a negative impact on social determinants of health is not only an absolutely profoundly accurate statement. It's one borne by the evidence this committee heard. It's one that was reinforced by the Minister of Health and Minister of Justice, and also will have the, I think, the very helpful impact of helping those entrusted and charged with enforcing this legislation in the future to remind them that wherever possible, to not use a criminal approach to cannabis is preferable and should be avoided at all costs, given the negative health consequences of criminalization on our population, particularly on young people. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. You're right on time. Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Davies. I agree with him on many of aspects of what he has said. You know, the war on drugs is a failure of prohibition. And I'd like to compliment Mr. Davies on the enthusiasm and care and concern with which he has addressed this file. Having said that, I think that the intent, the purpose of this bill is already very well stated. It is inherent in the existing purpose. And in that respect, I think that Mr. Davies' amendment is redundant and will, in the end, add no value.
Any other debate? Okay. Yes, Mr. Davies?
Call for a recorded vote on this amendment, please.
Calling for a vote on the amendment.
Monsieur Ayoub. Mr. Yolson. Mr. McKinnon. Mr. Oliver. Ms. Sidhu. Ms. Gladue.
No.
Mr. Van Kesteren. Mr. Weber. Mr. Davies.
Yes.
Well, I declare the amendment negatived. So, will the Clause 7 carry as originally drafted? All in favor? All opposed?